Pontiac is one of the most storied brands in automotive history, certainly American automotive history, and churned out a number of beautiful vehicles from the division's start in 1926 as a sub-brand of Oakland to the end of the run in 2010 when Pontiac was forced to fold as part of the broader bankruptcy for General Motors. The mid and late 1960s were arguably the halcyon days of Pontiac, where all the vehicles were just absolutely stunningly beautiful, sales were high, and the overall product was just a high-quality product that customers loved and enjoyed. Interestingly, however, the peak sales year for Pontiac in its history was 1978, when the division sold nearly 900,000 vehicles. There was a second peak that occurred in the late 1980s as Pontiac again became the excitement division, but after that point, sales considerably dwindled. Unfortunately, while many Pontiacs were great, there were some that certainly were not. And this list is going to focus on the top 5 Pontiacs that were admittedly the worst Pontiacs produced and sold to the public. Let's begin with number 5. In the number 5 slot is a vehicle that you're probably not expecting to see in the number 5 slot, but you're instead expecting to see it in the number 1 spot, and that is the Aztec. Introduced for the 2001 model year and continuing on to the 2005 model year, the Aztec is the proverbial punching bag of Pontiac, and really it gets an unfair reputation in that regard. Yes, the vehicle was not easy on the eyes, and in particular in the early years, there were tons of gray cladding that adorned the entire vehicle, and it really just did not contribute to an aesthetically pleasing appearance. The overall design was unfortunately a product of, let's call it, a large committee of people, and a classic example of too many cooks in the kitchen when it came to trying to develop the particular theme for the car and then execute it in final form. The car was also not helped by changing platforms to the minivan platform from what was originally a truck platform, thus endowing it with rather strange and odd proportions that the Aztec really just couldn't deal with in terms of its styling theme. That said, the car really was not that bad of a vehicle. In fact, there are quite a few great features about the Aztec. The interior was quirky, but certainly had some cool items, including, well, a cooler, a removable center cooler that you could take out that functioned as a center console. It also had speakers in the rear hatch area so that you could tailgate effectively. There was even an optional tent for the Aztec. So while, again, many people like to say that it's the worst car ever, it really was only the worst in that it wasn't the best looking vehicle, and as a consequence, it created a marketing headache for Pontiac. But as a car itself, the Aztec really wasn't that bad. Frankly, they drove pretty well. The 3.4-liter V6 underhood wasn't great, but wasn't terrible either, and the ride was actually quite comfortable. These drive and ride really nicely, and you can pick them up for almost nothing. So I have to say, to be honest, if you want to get kind of a funky car that you're going to get noticed by driving it and you can pick it up for cheap, get an Aztec. They're pretty reliable. They don't look all that great, but they're actually pretty good drivers. So that's number 5 on the list. Let's move on to number 4 on the list of top 5 worst Pontiacs, and that's going to be another minivan from Pontiac, and that is the Montana. There perhaps isn't a vehicle that's as incongruent with Pontiac heritage and what the brand stands for as the Pontiac Montana. It was launched in the 1997 model year and replaced the aging Transport so-called Dustbuster minivan that was introduced alongside the Chevrolet Lumina APV in 1990. While the Transport at least had a futuristic design and looked kind of cool, and it certainly was quirky, the Montana was just kind of a plain, vanilla, uninteresting, unexciting minivan. Had the same 3.4-liter V6 underhood that was in the Aztec, but it was completely unremarkable. I'm not quite sure why, but toward the end of the Transport's run in 1997 and 1998, Pontiac decided to make the Montana trim level on that old Dustbuster van and then sunset the Transport name for model year 1999 and transitioned it to becoming the Montana, perhaps because the Transport was known for having a plastic outer skin, if you will, that resisted corrosion, and the Montana did not share the same. It had exterior sheet metal body panels. Aside from being uninteresting, the Montana had a number of flaws, chief of which was that its U-platform that underpinned it was really designed with the European market in mind and Opel and Vauxhall variants. As a result, the vehicle was narrower and not quite as spacious on the inside as vans from other competitors like Chrysler. The vehicle also didn't have a great ride, wasn't known for its quality, and just in general was not a great minivan when you stacked it up against the competition. The previous generation had at least tried to be novel in some ways, including the use of individual bucket seats as opposed to bench seats so that drivers and passengers could reconfigure the van as they saw fit. The Montana really just didn't have much flair, and even though GM tried to rename it the Montana SV6 for whatever reason toward the end of its lifespan, it was discontinued after the 2006 model year in the U.S., really because of slow sales. But in Canada and Mexico, in part because Canada loves Pontiac, or at least loved it when it was still around, it was sold until 2009. My guess is that it was a pretty dry-eyed departure for the Montana when it left this mortal coil. Let's move on to number 3, and that is the Pontiac G3. A Pontiac G3, you ask, what in the world is that? Well, this was one of the rare cars that only lasted for one model year. And in 2009, the G3 was launched to Pontiac dealers only to be sunset a year later when the Pontiac brand folded. As such, all G3s that were sold in the U.S., at least, as I mentioned, were 2009 model year. The G3 was effectively a warmed-over, badge-engineered Chevy Aveo that really just had a different grille and headlights and some different taillights, and that was about it. It's hard to imagine the dealers were clamoring for their own version of the Aveo, but I suppose that was the rationale for inserting this into the Pontiac lineup because otherwise it really just doesn't fit the brand character. The G3 came standard with a 1.6-liter four-cylinder that was mated to either a 5-speed manual or 4-speed automatic transmission and made 106 horsepower. Certainly wasn't a fast car by any stretch of the imagination and really was just something to, I guess, give the dealers incremental volume as they were starting to struggle during this time frame with lackluster Pontiac sales overall. Needless to say, it failed, and many people completely forget about the G3 while remembering its G6 larger brother, and there was also the G5 Cobalt-based vehicle too. But the G3 makes this list because it was completely incongruent with Pontiac's DNA and was a poorly badge-engineered, warmed-over Chevy Aveo with a 106 horsepower engine under hood. Wasn't a totally bad car, but just not in keeping with the Pontiac brand. Let's move on to number 2, and that is the Pontiac Astra. Astra? I'm not quite sure. If you know, put in the comment section which it is. But the Pontiac Astra, I guess I will call it for purposes of this video, was launched by Pontiac as a sister vehicle to the Chevrolet Vega. The Astra was introduced for the 1973 model year, 2 model years after its sister car, the Chevrolet Vega, went on sale. Now, part of the reason, or the largest reason, why the Astra makes the list is because the Vega itself, which is the subject of a whole nother video, was really a deeply flawed vehicle. And it's unfortunate because the original Vegas actually were great-looking vehicles, and many people loved them when they first bought them. They were light, they were compact, they handled relatively well. They were fun to drive in many cases for a subcompact car. The engines were a bit crude, but as time wore on, the issues associated with the Astra and Vega really came to manifest themselves. Most notably, the aluminum block 140 cubic inch 2.3-liter inline four-cylinder that powered the Astras as well as the Vegas through the 1976 model year. Well, it had an overhead camshaft, and that was certainly somewhat novel, at least the domestic front for the time. It really didn't do anything very well. The engine was relatively noisy, and unfortunately, the aluminum block with an absence of cylinder liners often caused premature wear, and these vehicles were known as oil burners in the early years of their life. Later on, the oil burning reputation became so bad that GM actually had to rebrand the engine the Durabuilt 2300 as it re-engineered it in later years in the hopes of convincing consumers that it had really improved the overall reliability and durability. Pontiac did introduce its 2.5-liter 151 cubic inch Iron Duke engine into the Astra in 1977, and while still crude, that cast iron block and head engine was actually very durable. And so if you got to get an Astra, get a 1977 with the Iron Duke engine. But aside from the engine, the Vega and Astra just had severe rust issues. You practically breathed upon them and they would rust out on spot. That was a major Achilles heel for these vehicles that displeased customers. And also, while the vehicles were cheap up front in terms of the cost to acquire them, the ongoing maintenance cost wasn't as economical, I think, as people had hoped. That was in part due to the engine issues that I mentioned, but also little things like on these Vega and Astras, there's not a replaceable element air filter. You had to buy the entire housing with the air filter to replace it. Of course, I believe the aftermarket solved this by coming up with a design that had a replaceable element air filter, but you get the point. You can imagine that a customer wouldn't be happy if he or she went to the dealer looking to replace their air filter and realized they had to replace the whole housing as opposed to just the paper element. And that's just one reason why the Astra makes the list. It's really its association with the Vega, the engine problems, the rust problems, and the overall ongoing maintenance problems. It really doomed Pontiac in the subcompact space for a number of years from a sales perspective and started ceding the market share to the Japanese in this area very early on. Let's now move on to the number one worst Pontiac of all time, and let's see if you can guess it. If you said the 1980s era Pontiac Lemons, ding, 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 you win the trophy. When the Le Mans was introduced for the 1988 model year, it was designed to replace the T car, the Pontiac 1000, or the Chevrolet Chevette equivalent. And as opposed to the reputation that the Chevette had, which was basically as a reliable, economical subcompact car, the Le Mans was really anything but. It was a car that was designed in Germany, built in Korea, and sold in the U.S. and other markets. And if that's not a recipe for disaster, I don't quite know what is. The shame of it all is that the Korean-built Le Mans that was sold stateside was actually a vehicle that in Europe was named Car of the Year as the Opel Kadett. So what happened in terms of being lost in translation from that model in Germany to the vehicle sold in the U.S.? Well, a number of things. The assembly quality of the Korean-built Le Mans was not up to par with American standards. Everything from the body fits and finish to the paint finish to the interior trim bits, even though the vehicle was meant to be a lower-end car, just really were not up to par. On top of that, the 1.6-liter throttle body injected engine produced just 74 horsepower. It was an Opel-designed engine, but it was built in South Korea by Daewoo. And the 1.6-liter, for whatever reason, had a fair number of reliability issues, mostly related to stalling and a failure to start, despite the fact that it had fuel injection. And because in Germany, these vehicles were not often equipped with air conditioning, but in the American market, that was obviously a necessity, Pontiac retrofitted a very large air conditioning compressor to these Le Manses and really didn't have the appropriate support brackets to hold the air conditioning compressor in place over a long period of time and withstand the vibrations associated with it. As a result, people would often be operating the air conditioning and that bracket would break and the air conditioning system would just collapse and fall apart. So not a great vehicle for Pontiac overall. It would last until the 1993 model year, but the damage that this little Le Mans did was really quite severe. It certainly wasn't an overly unattractive vehicle. In fact, one could even say it was somewhat handsome in the coupe form in particular. But the Le Mans and its build quality really doomed it from the start, and it certainly did more damage than good, and I would contend even more damage to the Pontiac brand than the Astra did, because this was not Pontiac's first volley into the subcompact space. Buyers were looking at this point for a reliable car, and remember, Pontiac had made a resurgence by the late 80s to be known as the excitement division. This vehicle was not in keeping with that brand that Pontiac had established for itself, nor was the build quality up to snuff. And by the late 80s, Pontiac quality was actually pretty decent. Not the early 80s, but by the late 80s, it was. And for that reason, this Pontiac Le Mans makes the list at the top. But let me know what you think of this ranking, and if you feel if I missed any or misranked them, put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.